Positive? Do you want to double check?
Here we go.
Okay, so as you all know, the latest daft.ie rent report for Q2 of this year was released early this morning, and it makes for yet again very, very grim reading. 16 counties have double-digit new rental inflation. All counties outside of Dublin have rental inflation above 7%, and in fact most of the commuter belt it's 8 or almost 9 to 10%. And even in Dublin, while we've seen a continual flatlining of rents in the city centre, we've started to see the return to rental inflation for new properties in the Dublin county regions. This is the 36th quarter in a row where we've seen these increases. And what that tells us is this isn't a COVID rental crisis. This is a structural crisis of our private rental sector that predates both this government and the pandemic. But because this government has continued with the same failed policies in relation to the private rental sector as their predecessors, everything is getting worse. Obviously, COVID is changing some of the dynamics of that crisis, so you're seeing very, very dramatic rental increases, for example, in counties that traditionally wouldn't have seen much, so Donegal, Kerry, and other western seaboard counties. And obviously, as I say, the flatlining of rents in Dublin City. But even in Dublin City, new rents are still €1,900 a month, so little comfort to anybody who's looking to rent a new property. So what is the problem? The first thing is, despite repeated promises from this government, the last government, the government before, to dramatically increase investment in affordable cost rental accommodation, that has not happened. In fact, the paltry 35 million that Darragh O'Brien secured in the budget for affordable cost rental this year to deliver 390 units has so far only delivered 25. And in a parliamentary question I asked the Minister 2 weeks ago, he's refused to say how many of those 390 will be delivered this year, as if 390 was enough. Likewise, despite repeated calls by Sinn Féin and others in the opposition for a ban on rent increases, government hasn't done that. All they've done is very, very belatedly, having opposed linking rents to inflation for 4 years. They've now introduced that. But again, what you can see is for new rentals, that's not having any impact at all and unlikely in the time ahead. And then crucially, and one of the big concerns we have is in the last quarter, data from the Residential Tenancies Board shows that the number of vacant possession notices to quit of landlords selling properties has dramatically increased. It's now exceeding pre-COVID levels. What does that mean? That means the single largest cause of family homelessness before the pandemic is returning again. And as those notices to quit are worked through the system, we're likely to see an increase in family homelessness and children, as reported in the papers today. So what do we need the government to do? They need to do three things, and they need to do them urgently. The first is they need to return to the Focus Ireland Amendment. We have to have a ban on vacant possession notices to quit. If landlords who bought their properties with Section 23 tax breaks back in the Celtic Tiger want to sell the properties, that's no problem, but you sell them with the tenant in situ, and that means there's an increased likelihood that that property will be bought by another landlord. Second is we need a 3-year ban on rent increases. Rents cannot continue to increase at this rate. And the worry is, as we start to see a return to office place working later in the year, the flatlining of rents in Dublin city centre could start to rise again, and obviously that would be very serious. And the third is, whenever Darragh O'Brien gets around to launching his housing plan, we need to see hundreds of millions of euros being invested every single year to deliver thousands of affordable cost rental units. It is remarkable that a guy who sat in the opposition benches with me for several years is now a year plus in government and still hasn't got a housing plan together. And my big worry is when we see that plan, it's not going to tell us very much about what we're going to see of affordable housing delivery, particularly to buy and rent next year. So we need to see that kind of level of detail, but it needs to have an ambition that we haven't seen from any government for a very long time. Otherwise, what will happen is supply will continue to be strangled, rents will continue to increase, and more families will be made homeless.
Eoin, you're calling for a 3-year ban on rent increases, but you're very likely to be told by the government and possibly the Attorney General that such would be unconstitutional. Are you calling now for a referendum to enable the government to control rents, and will Sinn Féin make that a priority if you're in power?
Well, first of all, if the government claim that a 3-year ban on rent increases is unconstitutional, they would be wrong. Alan Kelly effectively had a 2-year ban on rent increases when he extended the rent review period. And some of the country's leading constitutional law experts people with as much, if not more, legal experience on these matters than the current Attorney General on the public domain, saying they believe an emergency 3-year ban on rent increases would indeed be constitutional. Having said that, if I was the Minister, I would go all the way to the courts to fight for such a thing, because it is necessary. So that's the first thing. Second of all, I've been arguing for a constitutional right to housing to be enshrined in the Constitution. I've introduced legislation which unfortunately Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have voted against. I welcome the fact that at least rhetorically Fianna Fáil and the Minister for Housing have shifted their position, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It's when we get the referendum from government, not what the Minister says or his backbenchers say on the floor of the Dáil or the Seanad. But I do not believe that that referendum is required to have a 3-year ban on rent increases. There is plenty of scope in the Constitution to constrain private property rights when it is in the common good and consistent with principles of social justice. But also, let's be very clear, right? A ban on rent increases doesn't take any money out of any landlord's pockets. Rents are higher than they have ever been, higher than at the peak of the Celtic Tiger. So if anybody is seriously telling me that a landlord entering the rental market now can't make a reasonable return with rents where they are, I think just doesn't understand the dynamics of the rental market. In fact, what we need to see is rents come down, and the easiest way to do that, as we've been calling for some time, is a refundable tax credit to put a month's rent back in every renter's pocket, again as an emergency measure for 3 years alongside the ban on rent increases. But the crucial thing here is supply, and there are currently 80,000 live planning permissions across the state, 44,000 live planning permissions for residential homes in Dublin, and yet the private sector is not building those units, and there's all sorts of reasons why. But while that private sector sluggishness is there, the responsible thing for the state to do is invest heavily in the building and buying of new homes, both social homes, affordable purchase homes and affordable rental homes. But that will take at least a doubling of capital investment. That will require at least 8,000 affordable homes, half to rent, half to buy every year, not the few hundred that the government is promising this year and next year. That's the real test of whether this government is serious about affordable housing. And again, we wait to see what the Minister proposes when he eventually launches his plan.
One of the criticisms that the government will level at yourself and the party to the left is that you're often hostile towards landlords, and we see in these reports that landlords are abandoning the market, particularly smaller landlords. If you cap their rents, are you not going to cause them to flee from the market even more?
Well, the parties that are most hostile to landlords are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're the ones who have created a dysfunctional rental system, and they're the ones that have presided over a loss of 20,000 plus rental properties from our rental market in the last 4 years. In fact, if what Sinn Féin has been proposing for some years was introduced, it wouldn't just give stability and certainty for tenants, it would give stability and certainty for landlords. The first piece of legislation I introduced when I was a newly elected TD in 2016 was a bill to link rents to inflation. A very sensible move at that time. If that had been done back in 2016, landlords and tenants would have had a fair deal, and we wouldn't be in the crisis that we're in today. So in fact, I would argue our proposals would give a much greater level of certainty, would end the volatility. There is an issue around Celtic Tiger era accidental and semi-professional landlords who are leaving the market. They were trapped because of negative equity right up until 2017. They now have positive equity. They want out. Those people do not want to be landlords anymore. And in fact, it has been Sinn Féin for 3 years calling first on Eoin Murphy and now on Eoin Ó Broin to review why those landlords are leaving, because we only have anecdotal evidence at the moment, and then put in place policies to try and prevent the disorderly exit of those landlords. What did Eoin Murphy do, and what is Eoin Ó Broin doing to deal with that? Absolutely nothing. They're in denial. So actually, I think we would be much better for the stability of the rental sector. We need landlords, folks. I'm a private renter. I have a landlord. Landlords who are providing a good service have a right to make a reasonable return. But I'm sorry, €2,000 to €3,000 a month for a standard apartment in Dublin is not a reasonable rent. And that's why the measures we're proposing are urgent, but ultimately would stabilise the market, and that's in everybody's interests.
Say around 11% on average increase outside of Dublin in rents. Do you think that's pointed to signs that people are looking to move out of the cities now that working from home is more of a reality? And so in those places we are going to see continued even higher rents than what we had been seeing in Dublin.
Well, a couple of things. So first of all, we were already seeing an upward trend of the commuter belt before COVID, and that's just because working people have been priced out of Dublin and we've been forced to rent and commute, whether that's from Kildare or Meath or Wicklow or Louth. That trend has continued, and I think it's a mixture of things. Some of it is to do with home working, there's no doubt about that. Some of it is because people haven't been working at all. I suppose they've moved back to where they're originally from and are starting to rent because it's a cheaper option. And some of it is just because people can't afford to rent in the city. So I think we're going to see continued upward pressure on rents outside of Dublin. But I do believe once, particularly office working in the city centre, starts to reopen fully, I think you will see a reversal of the downward pressure on rents in Dublin City. We're already seeing that in the county. So you've seen in the latest draft report increases, the most significant obviously in North County Dublin, almost 3%. But we're seeing it out of my own constituency as well as in the south of the city. So I think it's a mixture of those factors, but ultimately it's to do with affordability. Like if an average new rent in Dublin is now €2,000, like it's very, very few people who can afford that, and that's pushing people further out. That's then displacing people from those counties further out themselves. And again, it's just another feature of a dysfunctional housing system and a rental market that has been like that for a long time. Whether COVID is making it worse or just shifting the pain around more is unclear. But this is an inherent structural problem that predates COVID. And again, until we have a clear plan from government to say how they're going to tackle it, the crisis is going to continue to spiral out of control.
Is that an argument for perhaps extending rent pressure zones so that more and more are linked to inflation?
Well, I suppose the first thing is the problem with the index linking to inflation is all of the same loopholes that existed in the 4% cap continue to exist. So that means, for example, new properties into the market, properties that have substantial refurbishment, or just properties where the landlord takes a punt and when there's a change of tenant, increases it above the limit is still going to happen. Right? So the rent pressure zones did not work. We never had an effective 4% cap for all affected tenants within the RPZs. The second thing is the rule should apply everywhere. So whether one argues for linking rents to inflation or whether, as we argue, there should be a ban on rent increases, they should apply everywhere. I don't know any renter that can handle a rent increase at this point, irrespective of where their rent is at vis-a-vis the market. So there should be a single rule across the rental sector. My preference is after the 3-year ban on rent increases, you then link rents to inflation after the market has stabilised somewhat to give everybody some certainty beyond that. But the idea that there's one rule in high rent areas and then another rule outside, all that does is incentivise those people outside to push the rents up further. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, then they'll become part of the rent pressure zone. That's what happened over the last 4 years and it's what's going to happen now.